Hayalperestlerin, risk alanların, denemekten korkmayanların cesaretinden doğduk. Bizi asla yarı yolda bırakmayan o sesin rehberliğiyle ilerlemeye ve öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Bunun için varız. Bu yüzden gece geç saatlere kadar lambalarımız sönmez. Elveda demek hem hüzün hem de gurur verir. Her şeyi sorgulayarak ve merakımızı besleyerek, dayanıklılığımızı test ederek, sınırlarımızı aşarak, ilerleyerek ve yeni ufuklar açarak yeni bir yol buluruz. Yeni icatlar çıkararak, kendi yolumuzu çizerek. Burası, fikirlerin doğduğu ve yeni fikirleri doğurduğu, bizim de doğduğumuz, birlikte büyüdüğümüz ve yükseldiğimiz yer. Burası Yakın Doğu Üniversitesi.
Dear distinguished colleagues, researchers, and students, good afternoon and welcome to our event, which is jointly organized by the Departments of International Relations and Political Science and Public Administration, the Faculty of Economics and Administrative Sciences of University of Oxford. We are living in an era where wars and conflict force many people to flee their homes and seek refuge and safety elsewhere than at any time since the end of the Second World War. Displaced people and other migrants increasingly move out of conflict zones and also from the regions having high ratios of unemployment and facing with job security. In addition, migrating onto relatively stable and wealthy countries are increasingly on rise. In this regard, how does the European Union and the United States approach to the issue of migration? In which ways both actors externalize migration and refugee issues will be the cornerstone of our discussion today. Today we have an esteemed colleague and we would like to thank to Associate Professor Dr. Başak KALE for being with us. On behalf of Department of International Relations and Political Science, with my colleague Associate Professor Dr. Saat and the members of our department and our faculty, we would like to welcome Başak KALE. Let me first of all share her short bio with you. Dr. Başak KALE is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, and she is the former chair of the European Studies postgraduate program. She is also the coordinator of the Migration Research Program of Jean Monnet Center of Excellence Center for European Studies at METU. In addition to these positions, she is an independent ethics expert working for the European Commission at the Ethics and Research Integrity Sector, DG Research and Innovation. Dr. KALE is a specialist on European integration, Turkey-EU relations, politics of international migration, and research ethics. She taught and conducted research at various institutions, including Harvard University, UC Berkeley, Boğaziçi University, University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, and Hitoshibashi University in Tokyo. Currently, she is on academic leave and working with the European Studies Center, St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford. Outside academia, she worked extensively in policy development and civil society sector. She was also the founding and governing body member of Turkey's first migration research specialized NGO, IGAM. She is also a founding member of Turkey's Refugee Council. She has a DPhil from the University of Oxford and a PhD from the Middle East Technical University at Ankara, and she also holds a Master of Science from London School of Economics, and she earned her baccalaureate from Middle East Technical University, Ankara. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Associated Professor Dr. Başak KALE, who has warmly accepted our invitation to join us today.
Thank you very much, Nur Hocam. Like this really nice and long introduction of what I've done so far. It's a very privilege to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for making me part of this seminar series as well. It's a great honor. I'm quite excited. So without further ado, I think we can start the presentation. I had a PowerPoint presentation. Nur Hocam, which was also a friend of mine for many, many years now, will help me with this. So today we're going to be talking about the externalization of the EU and US migration policies. And we will focus on the securitization of migration governance. Under normal circumstances, these two topics were not so much related to each other. Over time, unfortunately, I will say unfortunately, and we'll come to that, why I say unfortunately, they kind of converged together, the EU's migration policy and US migration policy. And today we're going to see what type of convergences and what kind of similarities we can see. So what is the externalization? Maybe we can make a very short introduction of what I mean by externalization of the EU and US migration policy. Well, the externalization of migration policies has happened, especially after the 21st century, through the different types of border governance. And what we see both in the EU and the US is like a more of a focus or more of a shift over time, that the management of migration has been transferred beyond their own territorial borders. So it has been now given the responsibility, the border management responsibility of both the EU member states as well as the US to other countries and to the third countries, not necessarily always on the border countries. Sometimes these countries can be even beyond the border of these countries. And their responsibility becomes to contain, process, or sometimes deter migrants. And over time, it also becomes a responsibility to asylum seekers to assess their asylum applications. And what we have seen since 2025, the Trump administration, we see a bit further externalization of the migration policy, and which basically means that the powers of the US government is now have a more of a executive authority that is beyond the borders, and an increased military involvement, and in certain ways, certain legal protections, both for the migrants and asylum seekers, sometimes breached. We can move on to the next slide. So what is exactly what are the tools basically involved in the externalization of the migration policy? What we see is that there are different types of mechanisms and tools through the externalization, and this can be done either through bilateral or multilateral agreements by countries outside their borders. And they can also use funding, financial incentives or financial mechanisms to make sure that the border security is established through the borders that are being funded by either by the EU or by the US. And they also can fund certain reception infrastructure for irregular migrants or the asylum seekers beyond the borders of the EU member states or the US. They also use certain mechanisms like legal doctrines, that those legal doctrines can also kind of justify the actions that are being taken by these states. And I will come to that, the safe third country doctrine, and how it's done later on in the presentation. So why these tools are being used? These tools of operational tools basically done beyond the borders, which means that in certain ways, the cost is reduced. There's a financial incentive for these countries to use these kind of tools. One of them, it's less costly to do it, to handle these kind of asylum processes beyond the borders. And there's also this detention and remote asylum processing can sometimes be out of sight, out of mind kind of mentality. And the goal is basically, in a way, like offload legal responsibility, because both US and the EU member states, there are certain legal standards, the human rights standards, rule of law standards, that has to be strictly abided by. And when you're outsourcing these deterrence mechanisms, sometimes it becomes the burden, or it becomes the responsibility of the state that is basically taking on the procedures. So international legal norms might be a bit more difficult to in that case monitored. So through these mechanisms, what we have seen over time is that if we look in the EU in particular, because we start seeing these implications in the EU particularly after the single market as being established in 1986, because through the internal market, no longer the borders of the European Union member states become it becomes the necessity that the borders have to be demolished in a way for the countries that are being part of the single market. So in order to be able to have the four freedoms, the freedom of movement of goods, services, labor, and capital, the member states decided that the borders should be abolished, and it will be easier to be able to have transactions in a lower cost. While doing this free circulation, obviously the third country nationals, as we call them, become also easily able to travel from one location to the other, and that meant certain mechanisms to be put in place. So over time, the external borders became far more critical to be controlled, because the weakest link means that from the weakest point of the external borders of the EU, it will be easier for the third country nationals to enter the EU free area. So that's why we see that the securitization of the free circulation of persons become more and more critical. So we can move to the next slide. And through this securitization, externalization through securitization, we see that this who enters through the borders regularly, irregularly become interlinked. And also it became a divide between the EU member states. The southern member states that we call the southern member state, for example, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the southern borders of France in that regard, become more vulnerable to the irregular movements of persons. And what happens is that they usually, when the migrants usually enter the EU, they don't necessarily stay in the southern member states, and they move towards the north. And the northern parts of the EU member states basically holding more and more of the responsibility of taking care of the asylum seekers, refugees, and in certain cases, regular migrants. So this divide between the south and the north necessitated certain mechanisms to be developed within the EU as well. This is how we see the first country of asylum principle. So basically making sure that an asylum seeker entering the country, let's say that they enter from Greece, they have to apply the asylum in the first EU member state that they enter. So they cannot travel all the way to Germany or Sweden to apply for asylum. They have to apply the asylum in Greece. So this kind of divide between the south and the north, we have to keep in mind that creates the tension within the EU as well. So EU is not like a homogenic entity where all EU member states agreeing on these certain principles and rules. So there is a divide between the EU as well. So the EU policies over time prioritize securitization and the border controls as well. So starting from 1986, these mechanisms came into place, and a more security-based approach, which externalizing the migration governments beyond the physical borders of the EU, like such as the countries of Turkey, and we will come to that, to Turkey's role as well, become more and more critical over time. You probably heard the term Fortress Europe. This has been a term that's been discussed for decades now, and how the EU is trying to make sure that the borders, the physical external borders, again, underlying the external borders part of the sentence, the external borders of the EU becomes more and more difficult to be penetrated, so difficult to be able to be crossed. And this is done through physical walls, as we can see in this picture, the barbed wires, the walls, to make sure that it becomes very difficult for irregular migrants, as well as the asylum seekers and the refugees, to be able to cross. We can move to the next slide. This is an interesting map, and I took it, and obviously it's not my own. So you can have a look at this publication as well. It's coming from the Expanding the Fortress of the EU. As you can see, like the blue part is obviously the EU, but this is an older version because the UK is still part of the EU in this map. but ignore the UK part. As you can see, the EU has been developing a kind of a zone around itself, because these movements do not necessarily come from one location. These movements usually come from a long route of migration through different parts of different regions of the world. Africa, in the critical sense, because the population rate increase in Africa is quite high, the highest in the world right now, while EU is an aging population. And also from Asia, and as can be as far as Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even quite further away, Bangladesh. So when you're looking at this map, you can see that how the EU gets itself engaged in these different regions and different parts of the world, and trying to expand its migration governance. So on the one hand, it tries to work on how we can expand the control beyond the physical borders, because the physical borders basically end, as we all know, in the east part, Turkey, Ukraine, like Moldova, and on the southern borders, the MENA region, the African region, and also the Middle East. So this map goes beyond this maritime and land borders, and we can see that through different kind of mechanisms, which I'm not going to go into details of that topic right now, because we're not focusing on EU's external policies or foreign policy initiatives here, but they are interlinked. So we cannot necessarily differentiate the migration governance apart from the trade policies of the EU, or the migration governance away from the foreign policy of the EU. There are certain similarities or linkages between these three different policies, inevitably, because when we're talking about the financial incentives that the EU is giving to these regions, we cannot really put away the external policies of the EU as well. What you can see here is that the skulls basically is showing the debts at sea, and this has been monitored by different international organizations, including the Council of Europe, Frontex. As you can see, it's a very deadly region, and this is a very difficult crossing most of the time for irregular migrants trying to reach to the EU territories. What you can see in the blue are basically the military engagements, in the sense that the military industry and how many defense industry contracts that's been taken by these countries from the EU. So as you can see, like Turkey is quite an importer, Egypt is as well, and we can see in North Africa the engagement as well. And on the one hand, the corporate beneficiaries of these kind of engagements, there are lots of companies, industries, that private companies or state-related companies as well, that kind of involved in this border protection or securitization of the migration policy as well. Like very big global companies and local companies are listed there. So let's keep this at mind when I'm discussing other issues as well. This map, the zone of, in that way, containment, externalization of the migration governance. So we can move on to the next slide. So we saw the map. So what do we see in these externalization actions in that way? One of them, most of you might be more familiar with, is the 2015, it's called the migration crisis, but it was mostly like a refugee protection crisis due to the Syrian war, civil war. And especially after 2015, there was a huge number of people crossing the border. So that the EU-Turkey statement in 2016, which was basically the initiative of Meghan Markle, the German chancellor at that time, came into being. So this was a flagship externalization agreement aiming to reduce the crossings from Turkey, like to reduce the numbers basically. And it kind of put the EU's, it was like an experimental international initiative. So this was one of the first times that the EU come up with something like this, and it was heavily criticized in a way that it was criticized because it was putting the EU's normative agenda on hold while trying to get into a more transactional relationship with Turkey basically paying out Turkey to keep the refugees and asylum seekers as well as irregular migrants within Turkey's borders so that they won't be able to access to the EU territories. While doing so, it was also hoping to increase the interaction of Turkey and the political dialogue with Turkey as well, and reduce the deaths at sea. Because as you will remember, that time in 2015 summer, there were also lots of deaths at sea, at the Aegean, while lots of not necessarily the most safest routes were used to cross to the Aegean Islands. So it kind of put a blueprint what EU can do and what EU can achieve. And through this, the EU started having different types of mobility partnerships and return agreements. So there was also a part of the EU-Turkey statement was also this one-to-one principle. So every time one irregular migrant or failed asylum seeker is going to be sent back from Greece or the Greek islands back to Turkey, there will be one registered Syrian asylum seeker will be sent back to the EU member states, which didn't necessarily work really well. But it kind of stopped the irregular migration. So when the EU suddenly see that, well, it worked, the financial incentive will make a state, a transit country, to control their borders much more effectively. It is working. So in that sense, we can do similar kind of agreements with other countries around the EU's borders, and they can also do the same and similar things where we can stop or divert these migratory routes to EU. So in that regard, with countries in North Africa and Sahel and Balkans, the EU had tried to establish certain mobility partnerships and return agreements. On the other hand, Frontex, which is the EU's external border control agency, tried to train and equip border facilities in other countries. So its mandate wasn't necessarily to go beyond the EU territories, but even through this Frontex deployments, we see that EU migration became more externalized and going and doing things beyond the territories of the EU. I mentioned the funding of the transit straits, and similar to the EU-Turkey agreement, we have seen the transfer of financial incentives in other countries for them to use to make sure that the irregular migration is not going to happen. So I mentioned the Turkey-EU statement, which in certain ways, from an EU perspective, was a successful tool. It was a very successful mechanism that they deployed. In certain ways, in the ways that its goal has been achieved. So in 2015, as I mentioned, about 1 million irregular migrants and asylum seekers crossed the Aegean Sea, and about half of them were Syrian. The other half was not Syrian. So it was not due to the Syrian civil war that this kind of influx happened towards the EU member states. It was because of other countries who were producing irregular migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees used the same route to reach to the EU. This is something. It's like it's a kind of a prophecy that when successful irregular migration happens, further irregular migration is going to be sustained. This is in the literature, in a way that we sometimes see that the more migration happens, the more migration it will create over time, and because of the social networks and etc. And I mentioned in 2016 we had the Turkey statement strengthening border controls. I also mentioned about the readmission agreement and the readmission of irregular migrants one-to-one scheme and the financial assistance. So that was basically the framework of the Turkey statement. And after the Turkey statement, we see that the similar kind of arrangements have happened for example, in Libya, where EU funds and support for the Libyan Coastal Guard was utilized, despite the fact that there has been quite a widespread documentation of abuses in the detention centers. And also similar to Tunisia and Morocco, there were also different types of bilateral deals to prevent the departures to Spain and Italy. In Niger, EU tried to create a kind of a buffer zone and try to make sure that criminalizing smuggling networks happen, so that less and less people will be inclined to use that route to reach the EU. A bit different than these cases, but similar to the Turkish case, was the Jordan Compact. And the Jordan Compact, which was also a country that was supporting the Syrian refugees in the region, but less than Turkey. Turkey at that time, up to nearly 4 million Syrian refugees were in Turkey, but in Jordan, much less than that. And in the Jordan Compact, well, the aim was that it was after 2016 to give financial mechanisms to Jordan to make sure that the refugees would have better living conditions, so they can be at least integrated to the Jordanian society and have legal access to work. So that's one of the things that is critical. When refugees don't necessarily have access to their livelihoods, they are more inclined to leave the transit countries. So that was the aim of the Jordan Compact, to make sure that the legal right to work was achieved. And when the legal right to work was achieved and certain industrial zones, specifically employing Syrian refugees, were established, it will be more positive for the Jordanian industry to employ Syrian refugees. So when they're employed, and then they will be also, the female employment was also underlined here. And when they were employed, they would be staying in the region and will not be inclined to move to the other EU member states. So that was the aim. Similar, the Ethiopian Compact, because in the Ethiopian case, it's not the Syrian refugees that is critical here, but Ethiopia in a way just becomes like a hub from the neighborhood African countries, and Ethiopia is used to basically to be crossed on the route to the EU. So with the Ethiopian Compact, again, a labor compact agreement and a certain financial incentive was presented to the Ethiopian government to make sure that refugees are going to be employed in particular zones, industrial zones. So when they are formally employed, they will not necessarily would like to leave Ethiopia, and they will not necessarily would have the incentive to reach the EU borders. So all these sounds, good, but what is the problem then? The problem is that the legal and normative issues, so as I said that the Turkey EU statement worked. It worked from the sense of numbers. From the sense of numbers, yes, it worked. It was successful. But from a normative point of view, where we discuss about the EU's normative agenda, EU's aim to become a global power, while doing so, the normative principles that EU represents, which also gives EU the legitimacy in different parts of the world, is the rule of law, the respect for the European Union acquis communautaire, and respect for democracy, respect for fundamental rights and freedoms. So these normative principles give the legitimacy of a foreign policy agenda. And with these return and readmission agreements, EU was basically collaborating with not so always democratic countries, and also for places that is known to be having human rights abuses. The detention conditions and the reception facilities are not necessarily up to the standards that would be accepted by Council of Europe, because Council of Europe has certain standards and principles that they have to adhere to. And you cannot necessarily have double standards for what is acceptable within the EU and what is acceptable outside the EU. So if you're going to be externalizing your policy, if you're going to be exporting your responsibility to another country, to a third country, basically you have to necessarily make sure that the quality of the asylum seekers, the services, the hearings that they have within the EU will be exactly the same as outside the EU. So that was basically, while externalizing the responsibilities, these legal and normative frameworks were also, unfortunately, impacted in a negative way. So So whose responsibility? So is it EU's responsibility, or is it the third country's responsibility? Becomes the problem. So, well, we have seen that there are certain cases where the EU tried to shift the responsibility to the third country to make sure that they take it on and they deal with it, and they deal with it with the tools that the EU is kind of trying to export, and also the financial incentives to help the countries who not necessarily have the financial mechanisms to do all these, to be able to handle all this asylum kind of work. So that suddenly it becomes what used to be EU's responsibility become a third country responsibility, and not always the compliance with the human rights-based norms or the rule of law principles are some other authors. So it's a bit problematic. So we can move on to the next slide. So putting aside the EU, let's focus on what's happening in the US. So I kind of show a bit of a blurry picture or gloomy picture for the EU. So basically, EU is shifting the responsibility to third countries. It has developed certain mechanisms, financial mechanisms, legal mechanisms, and it has done it through a very complex network of foreign policy, external policy, as well as migration governance exportation. So what is happening in the US? I mean, I found these two cartoons basically from the internet, and I think it just kind of explains the irony behind it. Well, in the first one, it shows that no green cards, no visas. I'm sorry, but we need to see some identification. And in the second one, it's again that we see that the First Nation people that were in North America, seeing the colonial power is coming, and they say that, well, they look pretty undocumented to me. Well, that was the case, right? In the US, it's an immigration country. When we're teaching the immigration classes, this is the first thing that we say. US is an immigration country. It's based on immigration, and it praises to become be an immigrant country. So it acknowledges the fact that United States of America is founded by immigrants, and it is proud to be an immigration country. But is that the case though right now? So let's have a look. So we see that over time, similar to the EU, we see a US migration externalization, right? So, I mean, for those of you who are not very familiar, there are very technical terms, and I'm not going to go into the details of the technical terms, but just to give you a general sense of what is behind all what's happening recently. There are certain legal mechanisms that were in place for other reasons. For example, the Title 42 was mostly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was going to be ending. So before it was ending, there were certain legal procedures that had been taken, not by the current Trump administration, but by the administration, by the previous administration. There was also remain in Mexico. Again, I'll go into details how, like similar to the EU, it was aimed that the asylum applications would be processed not when they reach to the US territory or US land, but it will be processed in Mexico, which is also a very controversial issue from an international refugee law perspective, very problematic. The safe third country agreements, basically the safe third country agreements argue that countries declare, or the EU declares, or the US declares that certain countries are safe third countries. So because they're safe, they are, the asylum applications can be processed, or irregular migrants or failed asylum seekers can be returned back to these countries because they are safe countries. So if a person is being returned back to these countries, their threat to life will not happen, or nothing bad is going to happen to them from a human rights perspective. So they signed these agreements with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And we are hearing El Salvador quite a lot recently with the US politics, and a border cooperation with Mexico. Under both earlier Trump and Biden administrations, Mexico became like an unofficial buffer state. And we will see how the migration routes through happen as well. With the next slide, please. So this is prior to Trump, this is the second version of Trump, right? We could see the second version of Trump a bit more stronger. It's coming, and we see a bit more confidence in things that's been done. So in the Biden administration, the regional processing sectors in Latin America was used and utilized, and there were greater funding to countries such as Colombia, Panama, and Costa Rica to intercept irregular migrants. And they also tried to create legal pathways like the CBC1 app. It was an app that you can basically apply asylum before reaching on your mobile phone. You can use your mobile phone, you can download the app, and you can basically apply asylum before coming to the US and crossing an international border, which is the #1 rule to seek asylum. According to the 1951 Geneva Convention, you have to cross an international border to be able to seek asylum. And with this app, that you can do it in Mexico, and you can get an appointment in before, and you can get your case or file processed in Mexico before entering the US. They had parole programs, and there was all these created kind of a increased deterrence not to reach to the the US borders, and try to do it in the external territories of the US. And we can move to the next slide. So here are the routes. So you can see that until an irregular migrant, an asylum seeker, reaches to the United States, well, it's a very difficult and perilous journey, a dangerous journey, and it's a costly journey as well in terms of your life and in terms of your finances. And you need to go through various countries of Central America and South America and Central America. We can't see the South America here in this map, but it's a very long journey to reach Mexico and through Mexico to the US. Yeah, we can move to the next one. So Biden and Obama, so these things that we're seeing in Trump, we're basically a continuation in certain ways of the externalization and securitization policies of migration governance prior to Trump. So deportations are not unique to Trump administration. I mean, Biden carried out deportations as well, especially just before the elections, in order to, I think, appease the public. We see 271,000 immigrants deported to 192 countries in 2024, and about 1.5 billion deportation in his 4 years, which was the figures taken from the Migration Policy Institute. And during the Obama's term, which also included deportations, which in total were about 3 million people. It's a huge number when you think about it. And you can access the details in the BBC article. So there's also the apprehensions at the border. So in December 2024, again in the Biden administration, about 50,000 migration apprehensions, and from a really high number of 2023 to 250,000. So in the pandemic, obviously, these numbers dropped overall globally. People were not traveling. And in May 2019, for example, it was about 130,000 migrant encounters. So you can see that this is a continuous trend and number gathering. We can move to the next slide. So where do they come from? Mostly from Mexico, but we also see that Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, these are the, like, especially El Salvador, Guatemala, and Venezuela. We hear those names, but mostly from Mexico. And about the rest of the world, about 2.3 million. And some countries, interestingly, we see that coming as far as India and China. We can move to the next slide. So Trump administration. So this is a bit what has happened on steroids. We can see the externalization, securitization on steroids. So we see that there are mass deportations and detentions. Like, Trump is obviously trying to give a message to the public. We're serious on this. We're going to make sure that irregular migrants are going to be deported. Irregular migrants are going to be apprehended at the border. So most deportations and detentions, like facilities like Guantanamo Bay, are used to detain up to 30,000 migrants, as Guantanamo Bay has a notorious kind of reputation of certain international human rights law not necessarily always being respected. And these in Salvador now, certain facilities are using as detention centers for deportees, as we have seen on the news. We can see that there are certain legal and constitutional challenges in doing this. So, for example, nearly ancient law of 1798 has been enacted to be able to do these deportations, not without a trial. And it's always been an international law or rule that if the person should be able to seek for asylum, right for asylum is a right, and it's a human rights. And United States is also a signatory to these international treaties, then these rights should be respected. So in that regard, there are various legal disputes, and we can discuss it later on in the Q&A session, but there are concerns over these processes. And the major issue regarding that is also the refugee settlement issue. So in the first Trump administration, Trump basically stopped refugee resettlements. What is refugee resettlement? Basically, there is a certain amount of quota that US wants to fulfill as an international humanitarian mission or responsibility that will accept refugees from different parts of the world, and Turkey, for example, is one of them. If Turkey processes an application, an asylum application, and grants refugee status, there is a certain quota that US will take from Turkey, and no matter the nationality, it can be an Iraqi or a Syrian nationality or Iranian refugee, that they will take and resettle in the US. Other countries do that as well. Canada does that. And can we go back to the resettlement one? And during the Trump administration, it was stopped. And because it's stopped, there was an unbelievable amount of backlog. For certain countries, this is a very critical route and has to be supported. And US accepted in the Biden administration about 100,000 refugees, which is the highest because there was a backlog. They were trying to clean up the backlog. Now Trump decides that this is going to be stopped again. So no more refugees resettlement in the US. Yes. And the deportations, if it's legal to do to immigrants, is it also legal to do for citizens? Trump has this argument that he's now planning to deport some of the US citizens, the dangerous gang member, for example, US citizens that have been sentenced in the US prisons to El Salvador. I mean, well, this is unconstitutional. Well, he might try to do it. I find that it's going to be very difficult to be able to deport U.S. citizens to third countries like El Salvador or any other country. But we will see how this is going to be developed. And wrongfully developed people as well. For example, in the recent meeting with the El Salvador Prime Minister, he basically declared that he's not going to return back and wrongfully deported person back to the US. So it brings up all these discussions about how this kind of migration-related policies can spin over to other areas as well. And it can be used as whitewashing of other activities that wanted to be done by certain governments. So we can move to the next one. So remain in Mexico, as I talked a little bit on that, the smartphone app, and which was already controversial. And now Trump argues that this CBS One smartphone app is not going to be used. So there are right now thousands of people that are stuck in Mexico. They used to have these appointments, and now they cannot even go and see a US officer to be able to get their files to be processed. So Mexico is in a difficult position right now because there will be dozens of thousands of people stuck in Mexico, and Mexico will have to provide the services for these people. And this app, despite the problems, was basically also providing an opportunity for people who were trying to access the US through legal ways, not illegal ways, but through legal pathways. So it's also another problematic issue that we will see how it's going to be developing in the next couple of years. So the final issues that we might want to discuss is the targeting of legal immigrants and activists. We have seen the cases. For example, they can be students, activists, especially involved in pro-Palestinian advocacy, and the war in Gaza, for example, and in certain ways, it is raising alarms about the civil liberties violations. And also, US military is now being granted control over the federal lands along the southern border to construct barriers and detain migrants. So it also the militarization of immigration policies, like a hardcore securitization example, and the alignment with the Project 2025, which actions reflected the objectives outlined in Project 2025, a policy which kind of like more stringent immigration enforcement, and expanding the executive power and reducing the legal immigration pathways, which is also an alarming issue. So we can move to the next slide. And expanding the powers of ICE, which is an executive branch, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they have an ability to arrest and detain unlawful migrants on US soil. That's the definition of their mandate. But right now we are seeing that Trump administration is trying to increase their funding to $45 billion US, and it will make them a very powerful force in the US, and with powers that sometimes expand to certain gray zones that we have very recently seen. We can see the next slide. So, for example, the detention of students, like there is one student from Columbia University who was a green card holder from Palestine. He attended what he thought to be a naturalization test. He was going to become a US citizen, but instead it was kind of a trap that he's been apprehended and detained right now. Similarly, at Tufts University, Fulbright scholar Rümeysa Öztürk has been also arrested on the street because she wrote a piece on criticizing the policies towards Palestine, and her future is a bit now unclear. And also, like very recently, there's Harvard University's funding cuts, and Harvard is now trying to resist to the pressures that are coming from the Trump administration and trying to keep its autonomy. So we can see that it just doesn't necessarily stay at the borders, but also there's going to the shift of immigration policy expanding to regular visa holders, students, academia. So it is kind of spillovering on other areas as well. So what we see the shared narratives and mutual influences, both US and EU, has increasingly framed migration as a security issue, including the public discourse and the policy decision. And we can see that it can create kind of a ripple effect, like affecting each other. It's like a butterfly effect in that way. So similar approaches in different parts of Europe can be seen, and vice versa. And also the EU strategies have also informed US policy debates, creating a kind of a feedback loop of more restrictive, more securitized migration policies. So what are the critical implications? One has to keep in mind that using these legal ambiguities on the definition can be useful in the short term, but in the long term, this externalization kind of blurs the responsibility, enabling certain countries to avoid asylum applications. And it's not as simple as it sounds, because, as I mentioned, it has a longer term kind of implication about the legitimacy of these countries, their global roles, hegemonic powers. And in case of the EU, it wants to have a global voice. It wants to have more than an economic power. And losing the rule of law, democracy, protection, rhetoric, the normative power, the soft power of the EU, basically cripples its global aspirations. When it comes to the US, similar problems, I think, will occur. On the one hand, the US wants to keep its dominance in the international politics by crippling itself with saying that certain rules do not apply to me, also reduces the legitimacy of the US in a global scale. The human rights risks outsourcing to authoritarian, unstable states will obviously have human rights violations. And the policy diffusion area, like the practices are always mirrored, EU and US, both external, different kind of remote processing, biometric surveillance, I didn't go into that, and funding third country deterrence. And then it can also kind of impact different policy areas as well, which becomes problematic, like development policies become impacted by the securitization of migration policy. And the erosion of protection norms, international refugee regime, it was not easy to develop. And now seeing this erosion of some certain sacred kind of principles means that things will be much more difficult to attain in the future. And I think that's it. This is the border. I would like to end my talk here with the US and Mexico border. As you can see, more and more borders and walls we will see around the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we were going to see a more stable and secure global world order. Thank you for listening.
Başak Hocam, thank you very much for this comprehensive, timely, and insightful discussion. And I think it was a lecture at the same time. And while you were basically referring to the shared narratives, I was also trying to link it with the erosion of the international norms and values that actually what we have been facing lately. And then I would like to also highlight a point regarding the policy diffusion and this butterfly effect, because it seems like that there are certain convergencies among the EU and the United States policies with regards to this this realm. And then it reminds me, policy learning at the same time. So thank you very much. It was really a great, fascinating presentation. And as I said, it was basically a lecture as well. So the head of the Department of International Relations, Associate Professor Dr. Saat Akşit, says, thank you very much, hocalarım, for this insightful seminar. And he has also a to-the-point question, let me to share. Migration has increasingly been described as a global problem since the end of the Cold War. Do we see any attempt of coordination by the EU and the United States on their respective migration policies?
Well, Saat Hocam, thank you very much for the question. It's a very good question. And I wish that they had, that's what I would say. But I don't necessarily see that, for the Trump administration, the current Trump administration, I don't think that the Trump administration is coordinating anything with anyone right now. It's a very unilateral policy, as we have seen with the tariffs, as we have seen with the other policy areas, foreign policy areas that they are working on. I don't necessarily see any kind of bilateral, multilateral, cooperation or collaboration. When it comes to the EU, EU kind of, at least on paper, aims that they're trying to develop multilateral, bilateral kind of cooperative mechanisms. They try to collaborate, but within the EU itself is also very divergent views, and coming to a conclusion, even in the case of the Ukrainian crisis, for example, that one of the most recent crises that we've seen, even that, so it took a while for them to come up with a certain policy area. So I find it very difficult to see in the future that US and EU will be collaborating on have a more global kind of migration policy. But there were attempts by the UN. The UN tried to have a global compact for migration, global compact for refugees after the global refugee crisis, the crisis in 2015, 2016, in 2018. But even so, it was not a legally binding document. It involved all the EU member states, but without the involvement of hegemonic powers, unfortunately, I will have to say a very realistic point of view, but without US being involved, or without any kind of, in a way, a stronger kind of country agency being involved, the result was a signature or declaration, not a signature, but the declaration of a non-binding document. And it's like a goodwill document, and it couldn't move anything beyond that. So the answer is simply, unfortunately, no.
Mm-hmm. In this respect, may I also ask a follow-up question, seems like that, because most of the time what we were talking about regarding the European Union, and of course the European integration, it was something related with, achieving a federal, a peace project or supranationality. But do you think that the retreat from, or if there is any retreat, of course, from this supranational, let's say, structure, it seems like that EU is also acting more intergovernmental than to be, regarded as more supranational with the last decade. Do you think that this type of new policies, or the right wing or the far right wing rise, is also very much tied, intertwined with these discussions on migration?
Yeah, you're right, Nur Hocam, absolutely. I mean, that's the tendency we're seeing right now in the last 2 decades or so, hoping that with the end of the Cold War, more free world, liberalism, the rule of law will take over, especially with the Big Bang expansion of the EU. You would hope that these ideas of democracy, rule of law is going to be expanding, and it's going to be more widespread, accepted, not only accepted, but in the sense that more digested, more, be part of the democratic culture, the social social structure. We see kind of like an opposite kind of, development. I mean, there are various reasons for that, obviously, which we're not going to go into here. But unfortunately, this immigration became at the core of the debate. And that's one of the reasons why UK Brexited, like used the Brexit to get out of the EU as well. Immigration was one of them, one of the issues. But when you look at it, the irregular immigration that UK is experiencing was not that drastic or critical. So not always these issues are well-founded. They are usually like either played at, and sometimes like a bit, in a way, from the political point of view, from the policy makers or from the politicians, a bit lazy to blame the immigration, because there are structural fundamental problems, social problems, economic problems within these societies, and immigrants are the easiest in that regard to be blamed for. And with the aging population of the Europe and most of the Western world, well, immigration is probably the only solution. And despite what has been said, there is still, on the one hand, high-skilled immigration programs. All EU member states are employing it. So on the one hand, they say that they don't want immigration, but on the other hand, they're doing everything in their power. I mean, there are certain countries that we can mention basically selling citizenship right now, or residencies, like Spain, Portugal, Greece, Malta. Like, you can buy citizenship if you invest enough amount of money. So we see quite an interesting controversy that's going on. And it will be very problematic, because they need population, not always high skilled. It's also low skilled migrants are necessary to make sure that the infrastructure and the industries are going to be run. And the responses with the US is also a very short-sighted response. Like, we will see what's going to happen with the tariffs with China. Like making manufacturing go back to US, it's a very short-sighted, not necessarily very sophisticated view or clever view in that regard.
And our department members, Dr. Bülent Şenses and Dr. İbrahim Aybek, thank you very much for being with us today. And we have a question. I think it's very intriguing, since we are talking about securitization. Thank you for this timely intervention. In terms of securitizing narratives, what cues frames do they use to convince the audience? And if there is any difference with regards to these convergencies and differences, when we take into consideration EU and the United States?
I mean, obviously, there are various cues or frames that are being used for the audiences. And let me start from there before going to the convergence or divergence. I mean, basically, it is important that, you can have any kind of argument, but at the end of the day, you have to have the audience to accept these arguments, right? You can say whatever you want, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be followed by the people. What we see with the securitization is that these kind of arguments, like these kind of basically discourses are being accepted by the audiences. The audience have to be also more receptive to these claims. Basically because over time, the idea of the middle class has been deteriorated quite drastically, also in the US and also in Europe as well. So the generations that were able to, work hard, achieve a certain economic kind of living, and then retire and live comfortably is unfortunately not necessarily possible for the generations, including us. And I think the generations that are coming after us. I think it's a global issue, that the shrinking of the middle class, that there are problems with economy, and this economic disparities, these inequalities. This is a global phenomenon. So sometimes it becomes more easier in that regard. We're talking about the immigration-related securitization discourses being accepted by the audiences. So it becomes more easier, and the audience becomes more receptive. With 9/11, it didn't necessarily help. 9/11 and whatever come after 9/11 doesn't necessarily help with that. And I think the disappointment after the end of the Cold War, not bringing a more secure world with the ethnic conflicts, with the ethnic strifes, and in that regard, the wars becoming more difficult to understand for the public also is blurring the picture as well. When it comes to the convergence and divergence, what happens in the US has an impact on the EU. It has been always the case. With 9/11, it happened. The securitization of migration started also with 9/11, and blaming the immigrant who was not able to integrate to the society and blaming US for the policies that it has done inevitably impacted the policies that's also in the EU. And we have seen more and more. I didn't go into details about the technologies that's been used, like right now, the surveillance technologies, the border governance technologies, for example, drones being used at the land borders or at the maritime borders, different kind of mechanisms now. The EU is investing quite a lot of money on how to assess a threat before the person enters the EU territory. Like, by the time that, for example, you're boarding a plane, let's make up a country, Moldova, for example, your passport will be scanned, your face will be scanned, all your biometric information will already be in the system and match whether or not you're part of a terrorist organization or a threat. It's kind of scary in a ways that before you even board the plane, you may not even be able to board the plane. So these security analysis and the use of just AI, automated, systems deciding whether you're a threat or not, it becomes more sophisticated and complicated. Well, at least in the EU, there are certain procedures are in place, but what is kind of a wild, wild west is the US, because the US doesn't necessarily have those kind of safeguards at the level that the EU is implementing. EU is developing these technologies, but it's trying to develop these technologies at least in place that, well, we want to make sure that the human rights are being protected as well. In the US, and especially in the next couple of years that we're going to be seeing, we don't necessarily expect that there's going to be convergence in that regard. So in certain ways, there will be convergence in the bad, in a more negative sense, but we will not see the convergence in a more positive sense, unfortunately.
Dr. Ibrahim Ayber, who is a member of Political Science and International Relations Department. He asks, a few days ago, we saw President Trump hosting President Bukele of El Salvador in the Oval Office. And in this meeting, we witnessed him praising Bukele and Saat. And he continues, and which is described as the largest prison in the world where criminals are treated in extremely inhuman conditions. In this context, this is Dr. Ibrahim's question, could Trump's continued use of horrific examples from around the world as an example lead him to harden his policy towards migrants, whom he associates with crime in the future?
Yeah, Ibrahim Hocam, exactly. So there's no good will come out of it. That's all I could say. Obviously, when US administrations take these kind of examples and uses in different parts of the world, and that prison, unfortunately, is one of the most notorious prisons in the world. It can no way can be taken as an example of a good governance example, or a human rights protection example in any way. And then obviously this will lead a way that other countries will follow suit. I mean, it's already been happening in Europe as well, in the EU, for example. We didn't go into details about the MENA region and how the EU member states are using certain cities and port facilities into deter, because it's a completely different kind of discussion in a way. But yes, it will be taken as an example, and it will have repercussions in different parts of the world. Like UK government last year tried to do it with Rishi Sunak, arguing that they can just ship back everybody to Rwanda, like all the failed asylum seekers and irregular migrants, and they can be assessed in Rwanda, provided the funding to Rwanda, and Rwanda was happy to do it. And I don't want to say anything negative about any country. But certain countries obviously have been, known for human rights violations and shifting the responsibility to another country. And in that case, when it has been criticized and there were cases brought against at the Constitutional Court, it was also mentioned that UK can leave the Council of Europe. This is something I think it's outrageous to hear, unfortunately, that a country who was also a signatory, a country that was one of the founding fathers of, the Council of Europe, the European Convention of Human Rights, arguing in 2025 or 24 last to leave the Council of Europe. Yes, it will have a butterfly effect, and unfortunately, it can be repeated in other countries in the world. And there will be no legitimacy to argue otherwise, because the US will lose its legitimacy and the EU will lose its legitimacy, or at least impacted their legitimacies. And this is a very worrying issue.
Başak Hocam, by the way, let me also add, let's say, short note here. The previous question, which was about securitization, was asked by Dr. Mustafa Çıraklı, who is also the member of International Relations Department and the director of the Near East Institute. Thank you, Hocam, for joining us. I think we can take 2 more questions. One is from one of our MA students in International Relations, Ruben. Thank you, Ruben, for being with us today. This is his question. As long as third world countries are plagued by weak institutions, corruption, and worsening economic conditions, the status quo with respect to the migrant crisis remains. Well, I cannot see the rest of the question, but I can guess so. So what he's asking is, may I ask also the director to share this question on our screen, Ruben Harrison Akortia. Probably what he's asking is that as this continues, because you also mentioned, Hocam, the more migration, the more migrants actually will be on the way to move their country. So if we consider this economic crisis, economic recession, an increase in the unemployment rate, especially in the global south, how the northern, let's say the global north, can cope with this question? So I can complete Ruben's question.
Ruben, yes. Obviously the root causes of migration, as we say, nobody wants to leave their homes, right? I mean, normal circumstances, everybody will be there on home country, on your village, town. You wouldn't necessarily leave. There's always a reason why a person leaves. And this is one of the topics in migration studies, academics, scholars, experts trying to figure out what makes you to leave your country and what is the strongest motivation. And sometimes it's not the economic conditions. Just money by itself or the financial conditions in another place doesn't motivate you to leave. It's more complex than that. There is, especially with people who migrate sometimes and go to a country which has less economic advantages than their country that they left, because there are other things at play, like having a secure place for their children, better education, better health facilities, or future security. That if your country is so prone to political crisis, for example, or climate change, something that we didn't mention, because climate change is going to be one of the major contributors of global migration. How do we have a sustainable world where we will be able to make sure that the climate change is not necessarily going through the pace that is going right now? PIV studies show that there are more people in the US believing in angels than global warming. So in a country where the global warming is not believed, you cannot necessarily expect the government or the administration to take actions for the climate change, right? So it becomes a very complicated and sophisticated problem. But it doesn't mean that it is a problem that cannot be tackled or solved or is that hopeless. Obviously, development policies exist, and sometimes not necessarily targeting the necessary issues that they have to target. When they try to combine, that's why I try to mention with the EU. On the one hand, the EU tries to tackle with the development policies, let's develop the countries, let's create, for example, labor opportunities. But sometimes looking at the problem not at its core, but as a more kind of temporary solution. Let's stop the movement right now, because the politics is all about right now, how many people migrate, how many people cross the border. But sometimes it's important that keeping these, going back to your question, maybe, Nur Hocam, the supranational at core, because the supranational institutions do not necessarily always look at what is happening currently. They have to project and aim for what's going to be happening in 10, 50, 100 years ahead. NATO does it. For example, Partnership of Peace with NATO, they try to aim for the human security approach. So it is not the nuclear security that's at core right now, but other issues like climate change and movement. Especially, I mentioned Africa is one of the birth rate is very high. So you can expect that the population will increase. Even China's population is aging. Even like that's the reason that they got rid of the one-child policy. Even China, I'm saying even China, because you would think that with a population above 1 billion, you would think that it will somehow sustain itself. No, it is aging. Africa is not aging. So Africa, with the climate problems, institutional problems, just expect that they're going to be moving. Like people there, if they don't find opportunities, they will be moving. So the problem is out there and it's being underlined. I think the willingness and the push, and sometimes it can come through different ways. So I am in a way quite hopeful, because with these kind of changes, while there's politicization, where there's securitization, while at the same time we see more radicalization in Europe, but in other parts of the world with the technological reach, and people have a different kind of perspective of the world as well, and it should not be undermined.
Let me also ask the last question, but not the least, by Saat Hocam, who is also teaching EU in the wider world. Are we losing EU, the civilian actor power that focuses on socio-economic development as a way of containing migration?
Well, it's a tough question, Saat. Saat Hocam asked the most toughest question. I think that's the crises that we had basically with the EU recently, right? I mean, I have hopes for the EU, obviously, somebody working on the topic. And I believe that as a peace and stability project, it achieved a lot. And like EU has achieved a lot in the last 50 years. I mean, it has lots of mistakes that it has made, obviously. I don't need to mention those. But at the same time, nothing is perfect. And I think as a project, when I'm looking at the world right now, there are very few places in the world at this exact moment that you can be sure about your rights even as an immigrant. That's like you're not going to be deported because you will say something against, I don't know, government policy. As a third country national, you will be protected. One of them is EU. So no matter what, it is EU. Despite this polarization, despite this radicalization, despite this, populist policy, still certain things are safeguarded. So that gives me hope in a way that this project has worked no matter what, no matter the deficiencies, no matter the problems, no matter the shortcomings it has. Well, they have to focus on more socioeconomic issues. And the leadership is also important as well. It tried to change the focus. They tried to create this constitution. It failed. Sometimes it has to be embraced. But I think the essence is there, I think. But the political leadership is missing. The political leadership is missing. And I think we will see in the next decade or so more polarization, more populist policies. I think it's inevitable in a way. But I still have hope that its impact as a civilian power is still very valuable. Because there's no other country out there. I'm not saying that EU is a federal country, but there is no other, agency or there's no other alternative. Maybe Canada, but they don't necessarily want to be too loud. They like to be a bit more low profile, and they're not big enough in terms of population to have a bigger impact. I mean, Canadians should not hear me, but I think we don't have an alternative, which is good and bad.
Başak Hocam, I cannot thank you enough on behalf of the Departments of International Relations and Political Science of our faculty. We are so grateful with much appreciation. Thank you very much for being with us. It was a fantastic discussion with the questions to the point and intriguing questions. I hope the audience probably enjoyed and also received, or let's say we motivate them to think more about these policies on migration. So thank you very much for being with us today. It was our pleasure to host you.
Thank you so much for inviting. It was also an honor and a pleasure to be with you. And the questions were excellent, difficult, tough questions all around. So thank you for hosting me. It's always a pleasure to be part of your university, the department, and see very good friends like yourself, Nur Hocam and Saat Hocam.
And with Saat Hocam, hopefully we can also host you here at the nearest university campus.
I would love to do that. I would love to be back to Cyprus as well. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Görüşmek üzere. Bye.
Görüşmek üzere.
Hayat hızla akıyor ve biz bu hızı seviyoruz. Her güne heyecanla başlıyor, her anı doya doya yaşıyoruz. İlk günkü heyecanımızla yılları aşıyoruz. Zaman akarken biz de kendimizi arıyoruz. Heyecanla, merakla. Sen de kendini mi arıyorsun? O zaman zamana yetiş. Bu sadece kendini bulmakla ilgili değil. Asıl heyecan kendini yaratmakta. Bir şeyler mi yaratmak istiyorsun? Mükemmel. Metali işlemeyi, bir bina yapmayı, bir iş kurmayı, hatta bir şehir kurmayı öğren. Hayat kurtarmak, teknoloji geliştirmek, üretmek. Hepsi burada. Ve burada tüm deneyimler profesyonellerle yan yana. Ancak hızlı ilerlemeliyiz. Çünkü bugün şimdi gerçekleşiyor ve yarın çok yakın. Hayatta öne geçmek istiyorsan önce zamanın önüne geçeceksin. Hep ileri gideceksin. Bu Doktor Suat İrfan Günsel. Tanıyor musun? Onun da söylediği gibi. Üniversiteler toplumların dokuma tezgahıdır. Toplumları geliştirir, dönüştürür ve gelişmesini sağlar. O burayı bugünden yarına hazırlamak için kurdu. Senin için, ileriye gitmek için. Yana ya da geriye değil. Sadece ileri. Çünkü gelecek çok yakın. Hadi harekete geç. Fikirlerin ne kadar ileride olursa yarına o kadar yaklaşırsın. Yanındakileri de geleceğe taşırsın. Bu senin geleceğin, senin fırsatın şimdi. Hadi yarın yakın. Hepimizi ileriye götür.